Chapter 2. My Parents' Years of Transition. Now in Constantinople, Mother kept searching for Dad, asking people if they had seen him, and leaving notes in public places in hopes that they would find each other. She really had no idea whether he was alive or dead, or whether he had even gotten out of Russia, but she kept searching. After weeks of searching, Mother found Dad in that hospital that his men had taken him to in Constantinople. He was delirious with fever and infection. This was before the discovery of antibiotics. But by God's grace, Dad got well and eventually he was discharged from the hospital. This was actually the 5th time Dad was wounded. He carried a bullet which was lodged near his spine until his death. The doctors couldn't remove that without paralyzing him. Often in the future, I would hear him say, "I must be going to storm, my bullet is hurting." Now Mother and Dad were back together again with very little but the clothes on their back. All of these people that fought in the white movement were still fully armed when they got to Constantinople. They hoped to return and fight again. Now the whole White Army, hundreds of thousands, went to the peninsula of Gallipoli in Turkey. And from there, people started immigrating to other countries. For some, a return looked hopeless, but my parents had not given up hope. They went to the island of Lemnos, to the refugee camp run by the American Red Cross to live. Some of the refugees were already beginning to immigrate to America, and my parents could have immigrated also. But they stayed in Europe at this time because I still had not given up hope that they could return to Russia, the country of their birth and the country they loved. On the way to the island of Lemnos, they had to dump their weapon into the sea. Dad's friend, Dronov, a fellow Cossack officer, is the only one who hid his saber and got it all the way to France. Dad was hoping he would sell it sometimes, but he later gave it to a museum in Paris. Weapons were not allowed in the refugee camp. There were thousands of refugees. Lemnos was sort of a transient camp, and before long, Dad and Mother left for Yugoslavia. It was a Slavic country, it was Orthodox, and they were welcome there. You see, the Yugoslav felt responsible for the plight of the Russian people, having been the spark that started World War I, which weakened Russia and finally led to the revolution. Lenin lived in Switzerland at that time, and the Germans secretly snuck him into Russia to start the communist revolution. The Germans were fighting on 2 fronts at that time and wanted Russia out of the war. Russia already had a communist movement underground, and now with Lenin they had the leadership. Dad and Mother came to Yugoslavia in 1922. The years Mom and Dad lived in Yugoslavia, Dad worked building a railroad. Here's a picture of Dad with his railroad co-workers in Yugoslavia, taken in 1922 or 1923. Here they are again. Dad is in the second row, the second man on the right. Then in December of 1926, they left Yugoslavia and moved to Lyon, France, by railroad. Here they and many other Russian immigrants got jobs working in the silk factories. This picture of my parents was taken in Lyon in the late 1920s. This was about the time that my parents lost their Russian citizenship because Russia had become the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. In other words, Russia had ceased to exist. They were told to return to what had become the Soviet Union, or they would lose their Russian citizenship. They did not return because of their hatred for communism. The fact is, if they had returned, they would have been killed. But they never lost the dream to return someday when communism would be defeated. Before settling in France, they had the opportunity to immigrate to America via on the island of Lemnos. But they chose not to go, hoping that someday they would return to Russia, the country of their birth and the country they loved. Dad did not have any contact with any members of his family after he left Russia. Many years later, after World War II, when we were living in the displaced persons camp on Hanauer Strasse, one night there was a knock on our door. It was a man from my parents' hometown, Novocherkassk, who had lived in that same town under the Soviets. He told Dad that whoever was left there of Dad's family were sent away by the Soviet commissar in charge of their town, and that there were no survivors. Sent away meant labor camp or concentration camp. This most likely happened in the early 20s because Mother got her last letter from her parents in 1922. That's when they told her not to write anymore. They all lived in the same town.
This reminded Dad of an incident regarding this same commissar during the Civil War. During the fighting by the White movement against the Reds, Dad's unit had captured him. He was already a Soviet commissar, that is, a political officer. Commissars were the hardcore communists. This commissar was a former neighbor and boyhood friend. This is an example of the fact that not all Cossacks were in the White movement. Commissars were normally shot on capture. They were not taken prisoner. Dad, as the officer in charge, saved his life and let him go, because they had grown up together as boys. Now, more than 20 years later, Gleb's dad found out that when the communists won the Civil War, this commissar was put in charge of Dad's hometown, Novocherkassk, and he is the one that sent Dad's family away. As far as Gleb's dad knows, he's the only one of his family that got out and survived. Dad also found out that evening that during World War II, as the German army was approaching Novocherkassk and the Soviets were fleeing, the townspeople killed this very commissar. It was amazing to us that this man, who was also a displaced person, would seek Dad out to tell him the story about Gleb's dad's family and this commissar. They were so amazed because he was a younger guy who wasn't even born during the revolution, and he didn't even live in their camp. There were camps all over at that time, but even before this man told Gleb's family the news, somehow Gleb's dad knew his family was probably gone because he had not heard anything in 25 years.